Thanks, John. Thank you very much, John, and good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for being here this afternoon. It's a real pleasure and an honour to be here in Auckland to be talking about my city's journey to a zero or a low carbon future, and some of the learnings and lessons from Canberra that hopefully are relevant to the work that you do here in Auckland. So it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here. So as John says, I like to say I'm a recovering politician. I spent 20 years in public office and now working in the private and public sectors. And it's a real passion of mine to talk about the role of cities and communities in making a real and practical difference on climate action, because so much of the conversation that we have at a political level is often focused on what national governments are doing, what central governments are doing to drive climate action, but so much of the innovation and so much of the leadership comes from cities, comes from regional communities, comes from subnational levels of government getting their act together and really demonstrating innovation, leadership and influencing others. So tonight, this afternoon, I hope I'm able to share with you some of the learnings from the ACT and how Canberra, as a relatively small place in Australia, has actually had an impact nationally in terms of policy in the climate action, transport and clean energy space. So to tell you a little bit about Canberra to start with, we're not a big city, 400,000 odd residents, and unique in the Australian context. Canberra as a self-governing territory, has the same sort of powers as a state government in Australia, but it also has local council responsibilities. So that's quite unique in the Australian context, because in other parts of Australia you'll have three levels of government. You'll have local, state and federal. In the ACT you have just two. You have ACT, which is local and state, and then you have the federal government sitting over the top. So we have some interesting advantages, I would argue, from having that integration of city, municipal functions and state level functions. So I thought I'd just start, many of you will be familiar with this metric, but it's well worth restating that the challenge of climate is a challenge overwhelmingly for urban communities. A majority of the world's population now live in urban environments, in cities or other urban conglomerations, and they are fundamentally threatened by the changes that are associated with a warming climate. Importantly, we also know that 75% of the world's carbon emissions are associated with activity in cities. So cities are where it's at in terms of taking climate action. So don't ever let anyone tell you that cities can't make a difference. Cities can make all the difference, because that's where the activity is generated that is driving the impact on climate. And that's reflected, of course, in some key frameworks that I know Auckland's heavily engaged in through the C40 cities movement, but also through other movements for smaller states and regions called the Compact of States and Regions, and also the Compact of Mayors, where these are organising bodies that are bringing together states and regions from across the world to take action on climate. So whether it's clean energy, whether it's waste to energy technologies, whether it's public transport, whether it's adaptation, these are all the frameworks that these cities are signing up for. And I think what was really empowering was to see many of these actors being asked to take part in the Paris climate negotiations a couple of years ago. I had the privilege to be in Paris for some of those discussions, watching what the Australian delegation was doing, which was an interesting thing. But fundamentally what was very encouraging was that the UN recognised that it was in their interests to get cities and regional governments to come into the Paris negotiations. And that was twofold. One was to demonstrate innovation and the types of activity that was happening in the climate space at a subnational level, but also to put pressure on national governments to lift their ambitions and to sign up to a more rigorous climate commitment. So states and regions and cities were already engaged in that climate Paris process and were instrumental. And if you listen to Christiana Figueres, the lead UN negotiator, she would say herself, cities and regions were critical in influencing the positive outcome that came out of Paris. So these are very, very important global movements that we in cities are a part of. So I'd like to talk to you a bit about Canberra, the insights and lessons of the Canberra sustainability journey and how that's relevant potentially to some of the work that you're doing here in Auckland. So starting at the beginning, the ACT has 3 key metrics on climate change action. The first is to achieve net zero emissions across the ACT economy by the year 2050. The second is to achieve a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. And the third is to achieve 100% renewable electricity across the ACT economy by the same year of 2020. These are very, very strong and progressive targets. They certainly were when they were implemented in 2010, and they remain credible and relevant targets today. They were based very much on what the science was telling us about what the proportionate commitment should be from a city the size of Canberra to make its contribution towards achieving a safe climate future, which again is to keep the climate change to within 2 degrees globally. So these are milestones that have stood the test of time. This graphic that you can see is from a recent report by the ACT Commissioner for Sustainability and the Environment, which seeks to sort of outline our climate journey. And what it reflects is that in 2010, when our targets were first settled upon, we had gone through a very, very long process of community engagement. So in the period from 2007 through to 2010, we saw a real groundswell of activity at a community level, largely led by people out of the university sector, students, academics, but then also the broader business community. And we saw movements in our city like Canberra Loves 40%, which was a ginger group established to promote a 40% greenhouse gas reduction target for our city. And that ultimately gave us the political license we needed to legislate a very strong and binding greenhouse gas target. So in 2010, the Climate Change and Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act was established. It puts those targets into law. It requires annual reporting to the ACT's Parliament on progress against those targets. It establishes an expert advisory panel called the ACT Climate Council to provide independent expert advice to government on how to achieve those targets and a range of other reporting mechanisms, including an annual greenhouse gas inventory. So this was very, very strong legislation at the time. It was one of only 2 legislated greenhouse gas reduction targets in the country, but has since been mirrored by a number of other jurisdictions, in particular a number of large jurisdictions such as Victoria in Australia. So these are the basis on which we moved forward and worked out, well, what do we do next? How do we actually achieve these very, very strong targets, which the community and across government people have said these are the right things to do. So that's a bit of a topsy-turvy process, but politics is not always a perfect process, and sometimes you set targets and work out what you're going to do about them afterwards. So in the ACT's case, what we realised was that the fastest way to achieve that 40% reduction, and to give you perhaps some of the metrics of this in real terms, across the ACT economy, every year we emit about 4 million tonnes of carbon. A 40% reduction on a 1990 baseline year is actually getting us down from 4 million to close to 2 million per year. So that's a very, very big drop over a period of just a decade that we had to lock in. So we looked at the emissions profile of the city, and the predominant source of emissions, 60% of all emissions that came from Canberra economy, was use of energy in the stationary energy sector. So mostly electricity and to a lesser degree gas in buildings. So decarbonising the electricity supply sector became the key task for us to make this first step change and meet this first big milestone in 2020. So we set a target. Ultimately, it was to achieve 100%. We didn't start with 100%, we only started with 90%, but that was the target that we agreed we needed to decarbonise the electricity supply sector. And then we had to work out, well, what was the best way of doing that? And the best way that we determined to do that was a combination of rooftop solar as well as large-scale wind and solar projects contracted by the ACT government. So the ACT government chose to use its purchasing power to contract the development of large-scale wind and solar projects and use the green certificates that came from those projects to effectively offset the emissions associated with the ACT's electricity supply sector. So you can see the photo in the slide is of the first renewable energy project contracted by the ACT. It was a 24 megawatt large-scale solar farm at a place called Royalla. It's about half an hour's drive from the city centre. It's within the ACT jurisdiction. And it was the first large-scale solar farm ever connected to the national electricity market in Australia. It was the largest solar farm of its type at the time, at 24 megawatts in Australia. And it delivered at the time a record low price for renewable energy generation. Now this was in 2014. So in 2014, 24 megawatts was the largest solar farm ever built. 4 years later, here in 2018, solar farms in Australia are regularly exceeding 200 to 300 megawatts in size. So in 4 years' time, the industry has just transformed in Australia. But at the time, this was the first, and there was a lot of learnings about how do you build large-scale ground-mounted solar in Australia. Now, since I've been in New Zealand, I've discovered there's a lot of discussion about does solar make sense in New Zealand and in a place like Auckland. What I would say to you is that Canberra can be pretty cold, cloudy and foggy in winter, but we still have a large-scale solar farm. And if you think about the penetration of solar into markets like southern Germany, I think it'd be fair to say that if it can work in places like Canberra and southern Germany, there's no reason why it can't work in a place like New Zealand. It's about making and developing your specific business case to demonstrate that it can, but based on the solar radiation alone, there's no reason why it shouldn't. So what was really striking about this project as well was it was the first time that we chose to use a new contracting method called a reverse auction. So a reverse auction was a mechanism where you ask for the solar developers to come forward with their price that they need to be paid to get a project built. You choose the lowest price and then you offer them what's called a contract for difference, which is basically guaranteeing them a set price. They sell the electricity into the wholesale electricity market. If they sell for less than the set price, you pay them the difference. If they sell for more than the set price, they pay you the difference. And what's been great about the ACT experience through this reverse auction program is that frequently ACT consumers are being paid for the green electricity that they have contracted, because the wholesale electricity price is higher than the contract price that the projects are contracted to. So this is a very, very powerful way to drive development of large-scale renewables by using your government's purchasing power to drive the uptake of a new clean energy economy. We built confidence that we could deliver projects in an efficient way, in a cost-effective way that the market would respond to, and we also built confidence in terms of price. And I'll just go back to the other slide for a moment, and you'll see down the bottom the price for this project was $185 a megawatt hour, which was very competitive at the time. It was well below that anticipated by the economic modelling that was being done at the time by the Australian Bureau of Resource Economics. At the time, the Australian Bureau of Resource Economics estimated the cost of large-scale solar in Australia would be around $220 a megawatt hour. But with some good real market price discovery, we were able to find that it was actually much lower than that. And now large-scale solar in Australia is probably about $80 a megawatt hour. So prices have continued to come down over the last 4 years. So from that, we really got cracking and decided this was a mechanism that worked. How else can we grow clean energy generation for our city and decarbonise our electricity supply sector? We ended up contracting 7 large-scale solar farms across the country, 3 in South Australia, 2 in Victoria, and 2 in New South Wales, as well as another 2 large-scale solar farms in the ACT. Altogether, nearly 700 megawatts of large-scale generation, and importantly, we also were able to get a lot of co-investment or economic development outcomes from those projects. So I don't know whether many of you are familiar with the Australian energy market, but it's an interconnected system that stretches all the way from sort of central South Australia all the way up to past Cairns in far north Queensland. The national electricity market is a fully interconnected market across the southeast and central Australian seaboards, and includes Tasmania with an undersea cable that takes electricity from Tasmania to the mainland. So it's an interconnected system, so you can contract a project anywhere in that system and still get the credit for the green electricity that's coming from those projects. So as a small jurisdiction, we chose to use the broader national electricity market to support development of our projects. And by doing that, we got very efficient sites with good wind or solar resources that would be productive in terms of generation. But because we did that, we had to make sure that the companies we contracted with were still returning benefits to our city. Because if you're building a wind farm in Victoria or South Australia, that's where the construction jobs are. They're not happening in Canberra, even though we, as the city government, were the client. So what we said to those wind and solar developers is, what are you going to bring to our city? If we give you a contract as part of this auction, what commitments are you prepared to make to economic development in our city? And we got some really amazing outcomes. And these, I think, are relevant things to think about if, as a city government, you're involved in contracting renewable energy in some way moving forward. We got, for example, 4 wind development companies to open their operations or headquarters functions in Canberra. So they made commitments to run their businesses from Canberra for the next 20 years. And not only did they do that, they said every time they, as a wind or solar business, built a new wind farm in some other part of Australia, or in some circumstances in some other part of Southeast Asia even, they were going to run that project from Canberra. So every time they open a new wind farm, every time they open a new solar farm, they're running that business from the ACT, and they're employing more technicians and engineers and other people in the ACT. So you're growing an employment base in our city. So we ended up with 4 significant global wind developers opening their businesses in Canberra. Neoen, a French wind developer, CWP and WindLab are Australian wind developers, and a Spanish wind developer called GPG also opened their offices in Canberra as a result. We also got investment into our education sector. So the ACT is a knowledge-based economy. It doesn't export manufactured goods, but it exports training, skills, education, knowledge. And so we have a strong tertiary education sector. We have 4 universities. We have federal research institutions like the CSIRO. We have private R&D activity in the city. So we wanted to strengthen that part of our economy because that was our natural strength. So we ended up getting over $500 million worth of investment into our city, including funding into our tertiary education sector, to fund new training in wind resource mapping skills, for example, at a master's level at the university, skills trade training for wind turbine maintenance, so that people who were working on wind farms could actually be trained in how to do that at our TAFE rather than in some other part of the world, which is what was happening previously. And investment in new technologies like hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. These were all commitments that were made by those winners in our reverse auction program. So I guess a message for you there is, if you're using government contracting power, you need to be thinking about how you leverage co-benefits from your partners. These are not things that are requiring any taxpayer subsidy or grant. They are entirely driven as part of the package you get for contracting with a wind or solar developer. So this program really had a lot of policy influence. And I guess a key message for you today is, if you have policy innovation, you are going to have influence on other levels of government. And you're going to be able to get them to do more of what you think is the right thing to do because you've shown them that it works. So in this case, the reverse auction program has since been adopted by the Victorian government and the Queensland government, who have both used reverse auctions for over 1,000 megawatts of renewable energy generation in their jurisdictions. It's also been used in New South Wales. And importantly, some other innovations that came with the program, such as for the first time requiring auction participants to have community engagement outcomes as part of their proposals, and co-benefit and economic development outcomes, as I've just mentioned, as part of their proposals, have been copied by other jurisdictions. So this really shows that if you've got a really good sustainability innovation, other levels of government are going to look at what you're doing and go, wow, we'd like a piece of that. How do we do that? So for a small jurisdiction, you can still have influence. You can still drive change. And I think that's a really important message from the ACT experience. One other thing that's worth mentioning from the ACT reverse auction program was we also established a distributed battery storage initiative. So we have supported 36 megawatts of distributed battery storage across the city. It's about 5,000 sites when it's fully subscribed in 2020. And that's all been funded by the money that came from the winners of our reverse auction program. So again, no government grant, no taxpayer money, cash contributions explicitly requested from our bidders as a condition in participating in our last reverse auction program. And that will save us, in terms of electricity network augmentation, somewhere between $30 and $80 million worth of additional capital that would otherwise have to occur to manage growth in our electricity network. So another really good way that you can drive innovation but also deliver real value back to your community in terms of avoided costs in your electricity networks. Because ultimately those costs are all passed on, of course, to consumers. I do like to include this slide. This is the Hornsdale wind farm. Stages 1, 2 and 3 were supported by the ACT government, contracted to the ACT for our green electricity supply. It's one of the largest wind farms in Australia. It's in South Australia. And importantly, it's also now the site of Elon Musk's big battery project. I'm sure many of you have heard of the big battery project in Australia. It's the largest industrial scale battery project in the world to date, and it is hosted at the Hornsdale wind farm. So as a consequence of the ACT's contracting, we gave the South Australian government the platform to come in and deploy the big battery. And importantly, that battery is managed by one of those wind companies that runs its business from the ACT. So again, it just really shows you get this lovely momentum happening and other things start to come in behind. This is a project that's attracted global interest, and it's really used a platform of some of the work that was laid a couple of years before in the ACT reverse auction program. Oops. So I guess one of the things I'm keen to share with you today is there are real opportunities in sharing the benefits of the clean energy transition. The level of investment in new build energy generation globally is estimated between now and 2040 to be $10.2 trillion. So between now and 2040, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, the amount of money that will be spent globally on new energy generation of all types of technology, $10.2 trillion. And breaking that up, 80% of that $10.2 trillion will be in clean energy generation technologies. So yes, people are still building coal plants and gas plants and so on, but they're building a lot more of clean energy generation facilities. So the challenge for all of us, if we are running a city government, if we're running a business, if we're a community-based organisation, if we're running a regional government or a central government, is how do we make sure our communities get a share of that $10.2 trillion worth of investment that's circulating around the globe over the next 30 years? How do we make sure we get our fair share of that and get benefits for our local community as a result? And that's what we try to do with the ACT. You can see some of the metrics there. I've mentioned them already, but the headline figures, $500 million worth of investment into the ACT economy, only 700 megawatts of projects supported as a result of that, but investment in our universities, in research skills, in development, in hydrogen fuel cell technology, microgrid and battery storage technology. So really those are enduring benefits to our community as a result of a one-off procurement. And it's well worth thinking about that when you're devising your own strategies. So we're now on track to achieve 100% renewables by the year 2020. You can see the emissions drop dramatically in the next year or so when all the projects finally come online and are actually generating. A number of them are still being built, but when they are all generating, the ACT's emissions will fall and we will achieve a 40% reduction in our emissions profile. But that leaves us then with the next challenge, which is all the other parts of the economy. They're actually a lot harder than electricity. So transport, waste, natural gas. Natural gas is a big energy source in Australia. I know not so much here in New Zealand, but natural gas is used for a lot of home heating and obviously for cooking and industrial processes in Australia. So that is an important emissions source that has to be addressed, as well as a range of other sectors. But what this chart shows you is if you look at the green and the yellow, I think that's right. I'm sorry, I'm colourblind, so I don't always get those right. You can see the electricity sector there. It sits at 57% in the green and goes to 0 in 2020. But transport as a share of emissions goes from 25% to 62%. So transport emissions become our next big challenge as a city. How do we decarbonise the transport sector and to a lesser degree the waste sector, as well as the contribution of natural gas? So that is where the attention of Canberra now from a policy perspective is shifting, and this is a challenge that is familiar with many cities around the world. So the first big step change for us is to make the leap and invest in a large-scale light rail project for our city. Canberra is designed to be a city of the car. Has anyone been to Canberra? How have you found it getting around without a car? It's hard going. So it's a beautiful city, but it's very, very dispersed and very car reliant. So 92% of all journeys in the city are by the car. So encouraging strong modal shift to other forms of transport is critically important if we're going to reduce the emissions intensity in the transport sector. And one of the key ways we're going to do that is to focus on bringing for the first time world-class public transport to the city in the development of a light rail network. This is stage one, a $750 million public-private partnership, 12 kilometres from the northern developing suburbs of the city into the city centre. It'll be 100% renewable in terms of its operations and its electricity supply. It will be the first tram system in the country that will allow bikes on board, so you'll be able to bring your bike on board as part of your journey, take it off and keep going as you finish your journey in another part of the city. So we're really focused on livability around the delivery of this network, and we're also very, very focused on urban redevelopment along the light rail corridor. So a lot of redevelopment activity and densification and transit-oriented development is occurring along the corridor associated with this very, very big change for our city. So the picture you see there is of the terminus in the city centre. Sorry, I'm struggling with that. Oops. Gone too far. Showed you my punchline, doesn't matter. So that's a picture of the light rail network coming in from the northern suburbs. That'll be, so you can see there's already densification occurring, and whilst that's an artist's impression, that's actual development that's already occurred along the corridor as a result of the decision to invest in this light rail already. So we're already getting densification as a consequence. This project, central to achieving modal shift. What was very interesting about this project, and I'm sure it's not an unfamiliar story here in New Zealand and elsewhere, is the debate about the economics of the project was a really big political debate in our city. So we did a business case for the development of this project. It had a cost-benefit analysis of about 2.3. So for every dollar spent, there was just over $1 in additional value. But that was considered pretty marginal by the economists, and it was used as a critique of the project by those who were opposed to it. Interestingly, in Australia, just in the last week, one of our leading economic think tanks, a group called the Grattan Institute, came out and said that there should be a change in the discount rates used for calculating large-scale urban public transport projects, and to reduce the discount rate to more properly reflect the value of money over time and the relative benefit of large-scale rail projects. I only wished I'd said that about 2 years ago when we were having the debate about the Capital Metro project and the relative economic value of it. It would have been an easier argument to prosecute. But it nevertheless highlights that so much is integral in how you devise the rationale for these projects, but also your willingness to stick with them when you know it's the right long-term decision, even when some of the metrics you know are not as robust as you wish they were because of assumptions around things like discount rates, which is certainly something we were familiar with in the development of this project's business case. So it ended up being a very tough political fight. Unfortunately, the decision to build this project led right up to an ACT election. So we had our political opponents fighting to say, we're going to cancel this project. We're not going to proceed with light rail. We're going to invest in more road infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Or we're going to invest in things like hospitals and things like that, other than a $750 million project. It was a very, very tough, very hard fought political campaign. But importantly, the government had locked in behind this business case. It recognised that this was a long-term investment for the city. It was going to make a difference, and we needed to persevere even when we had polls showing us that 45% of people didn't support it. So the question was, the poll that counted on election day, how did we go? And the answer to that is that my colleagues were returned. I wasn't contesting that election, but my colleagues were returned to a fifth term in government, and they committed not just to the completion of stage 1, but to build stage 2. So that paradigm shift in thinking about transport already paid dividends. And we suddenly had commitment to say we're going to take stage 2, to take it from the city centre at the top of that map, across the lake and down to the south side of the city, through the parliamentary triangle, through all the national institutions, Parliament House and so on, and then down to the southern suburbs of Canberra. So a really big win that fundamentally remakes the structure of our city by investing for the first time in dedicated public transit using a light rail vehicle. So where to next? We've got light rail happening, we've got renewable energy happening. Some of the areas that we're now starting to focus on is electric buses. Decarbonising the electric bus fleet is a really important task in terms of the ACT government's own target to achieve carbon neutral operations by 2020. 20% of the government's emissions are associated with the operation of the public transport fleet. It's a government-owned public transport fleet. So there's an opportunity to look at using electric buses for the first time rather than the emissions Euro standard diesel buses that are currently used. And there are real benefits to this, not just from a decarbonisation perspective, but also from a urban amenity perspective. Electric buses are quiet, so they reduce that noise pollution impact. They're very suitable for operating in pedestrianised environments, but also semi-enclosed environments. If you want to bring a bus into a semi-enclosed mall or something like that, electric buses work very well in that environment. And there's also no particulate pollution associated with the fuel consumption. So the particulate pollution you get from diesel is still present, even with the very high standards that are applied today in terms of emissions. It's still there as a pollution problem in cities, and again, that's not particularly suitable in high urbanised environments. So that's a picture of the electric bus that's being trialled by the ACT government at the moment, and both South Australia and Queensland governments are also trialling the use of electric vehicle buses right now. Hopefully that will work for me shortly. There we go. And the great advantage about electric buses, of course, is that they're also batteries on wheels. So this is a mobile battery storage capability, not just a public transport benefit or a decarbonisation benefit. So the illustration you can see there shows that buses tend to work in a morning peak and an afternoon peak, and bus fleets are not so busy in the middle of the day. And many buses, at least in the ACT, different cities will vary, return to depot and sit in depot over the middle of the day and then go back out in the afternoon for the afternoon peak. So this aligns very well with a process that involves charging, first of all, overnight, whether you're using, say, a wind resource or some other form of renewable resource, over the night time for charging. Buses operating in the morning peak, return to depot, and certainly in the Australian context, the capacity to have charging with solar over the middle of the day. So recharge over the middle of the day with rooftop solar at your depot or some other location, or through a power purchase agreement with a large-scale solar project or wind project. And then operations in the afternoon, coming back into the depot late in the afternoon and delivering some electricity arbitrage in the late afternoon peak when demand is at its highest, everyone's coming home from school, from work, switching on their appliances, switching on their cooling or their heating, whatever it may be, and those batteries are able to discharge and sell at value later in the day. So this is a really powerful model that's now starting to be explored in the Australian market. We did some figures on what was possible initially in the ACT. For 40 buses, 12 megawatt hours of storage potentially could be deployed from those 40 buses. It would avoid electricity network augmentation, again, in parts of the electricity network, but it would still allow you to get that flexibility in terms of your bus operations during the day. And importantly, it delivers some real savings, about 30% reduction in your operational savings against business as usual for diesel buses. So that's a really powerful saving if you're running a bus fleet or paying for a bus fleet. If you can get a 30% reduction in your operational costs, mostly through fuel savings, then that's a really significant reduction. There's also some savings there associated with maintenance, because electric buses have less moving parts and so on. They're a little bit less maintenance intensive compared to diesel. Yes? Well, look, that would be an operational decision for the bus operator. In the ACT, the main price is not the main consideration in terms of whether or not people use buses. It's actually frequency and reliability that are the key drivers in people choosing to swap from cars to public transport. So I guess to go a bit further on that, we worked out that for the cost of procuring 40 diesel buses, you could get 45 electric buses in terms of the net present value saving over business as usual. So you could actually effectively, for the amount of money you were spending on diesel buses, you could get more electric and have more electric on the road. And that's probably a better outcome in terms of more of bus availability, better frequency, and so on, which are the real factors that drive patronage. Price is, people in Canberra pay more for parking than they do to travel on public transport. So it's more about convenience and frequency than it is about price. So you can see the two charts there, diesel, very big cost associated with fuel, that saving, that cost greatly reduced on electric, as well as a reduction in maintenance. And then you get a little bit of electricity arbitrage on top, where you're selling electricity at times when it has high value because you've been storing it and are able to dispatch it back into the grid. So a really powerful opportunity that's now being explored by a number of state governments in Australia and hopefully here in New Zealand as well. The other initiative I was keen to talk to you about briefly was zero carbon communities, and I've chosen one in Canberra called Ginninderry, which is out on the urban western edge of Canberra, so it's not a good place to build a suburb in terms of accessibility. It's about 30 kilometres from the city centre. It's poorly served by public transport because it's right on the urban edge. But despite that, the developers here have made a genuine commitment to improve the whole of life costs for people who are living in the suburb and reduce the carbon intensity of a new suburban development. So here, first of all, they're applying the 6-star Green Star Communities tool from the Green Building Council of Australia. It'll be the first new Australian suburb to trial all new electric solutions. So for the first time, natural gas is being stripped out of the suburb development. And that requires regulatory change because you've got to give the developer an exemption from the planning and development code that would otherwise require them to reticulate natural gas as standard through the suburb. And we're mandating rooftop solar in that development. And what sort of savings is that delivering, or will that deliver for households? Sorry. There we are. Combined with all electric heating and cooling, heat pumps for hot water, as well as a mandatory energy efficiency rating of 6 stars for those dwellings. The business as usual case on the graph, which is the column on the far left, is an average household price for energy of about $2,500 a year for gas and electricity. That's pretty standard in Australia. It's higher in Canberra, it's higher in other parts of Australia. But the option that's been chosen for the trial gets that household cost down to under $1,000 a year in terms of their ongoing energy costs each and every year. So there's a real opportunity to design our suburbs smarter by using all electric solutions and combining them with distributed generation, and that's without some of the other options that would achieve even greater savings around storage, distributed storage. So one of the options, option 6 and option 7, involve distributed storage and a microgrid to allow electricity to be traded between households. That hasn't been implemented, but you can see the savings are even greater, around $600 to $700 a year electricity and energy bill, rather than the $2,500 that households are paying at the moment. So a really powerful example of what's possible if you get a developer on board who's thinking about the importance of selling their subdivision not just as a short-term land availability question, but as a long-term whole cost of living equation. And I think that's a really great example that we want to see more developers mirror in the ACT and in Australia. Finally, the ACT does have an adaptation strategy, but I won't talk a lot about that. except to note that it's an important part of the overall sustainability picture for our city. And John's telling me that we need to wrap up, so I'm going to wrap up and just leave you with some key messages. And the first of those is leadership has influence, policy innovation has influence. If you work with community and if you get some momentum in your sustainability issues, you really start to build a virtuous circle where you get more innovation and competition to show who's best. And I think that's the great outcome you can get from being on this journey. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thanks, Simon. I know we have about 5 minutes for questions, and he kind of went everywhere there in terms of all the solutions that we think about on a daily basis. So if we can keep it short and sharp with a couple key questions, and I don't know if you've got a little time to stick around afterward, but people go to meetings and that kind of thing. So maybe just a few questions anybody has. Simon. He covered it all. Sorry to rush you there. Yeah, Matt.
What would be your priority? Focusing on community and getting the support there, focusing on policy or focusing on innovation? Which way around would you do it? Or is it all three at once?
It has to be all three at once, but I think policy and innovation can be very powerful in combination. So I think build confidence that your policy solutions are robust and work with key decision makers. Show that and get an early win. Find an early win that helps you build momentum. So try and find a little landmark project. Doesn't have to be huge, but a landmark project that demonstrates that the innovation works and that the assumptions behind it are robust. Because then you get political leaders wanting to go and stand next to it and have their photo taken, right? And that's got to be the best way of building momentum to do more and influencing decision makers. So I'd lead with policy and innovation and get an early win, get an early landmark, even modest win on the ground that allows you to do more. Yes?
You mentioned that weight and transport were the key challenges after the first two.
Yes.
Transport, you mentioned what happened. Did you have any thinking about waste?
Yeah. So waste is a really big challenge in the Australian context, and I don't know if you've noticed, but in a place like Victoria, the Chinese government's just refused to take all of this recycling material from the Australian market. Is that happening here too? Yeah, so it's a really big problem. It sort of puts a lie to our recycling efforts in a way, doesn't it? It makes us think again about how sustainable our solutions are. So in the ACT, two things that are being looked at. The first is recycling of putrescible waste from the domestic waste stream, so household rubbish collection. At the moment, organic waste is not separated out from the other waste stream. We do have plastics and glass and paper recycling separated, but we don't have food waste and other general waste separated. So the development of a putrescible waste recycling facility to separate out that organic waste and use it either for energy generation or composting type product is what's being explored at the moment. The other is in terms of human waste through the sewage system. There is a sludge product created at the end of tertiary sewage treatment, which in the ACT is currently incinerated using heavy fuel oil. So we're looking at a biodigester technology to create methane and use that for energy generation. And that could also be applied for putrescible food waste as well. So that's what's happening in the waste sector.
How about one more?
Yep.
On your graph showing tracking down to meet the 2040 target, was it with up in do you know what that's from?
Just before we dive down.
Yeah, before the projected.
Yeah, so that reflects what that reflects is part of our projection is our proportionate share of the Australian national target, Australian greenhouse gas emissions. And what happened was when the carbon price was repealed, I was asked this last night and I went and went and had a think about it, and I realise now what it is. When the carbon price was revealed, the emissions intensity of the Australian economy went back up. So that reflects our proportionate increase of that overall national increase. So emissions have gone back up since the carbon price was repealed in 2016, I think that was. 2015.